Hello and welcome to this session of the Association of State Floodplain Managers annual conference. We're here to talk about social justice, equity, and flood risk management. My name is Matt Little and I am your moderator for today. I'm currently an associate director at Guidehouse, a consulting firm that supports resilience and mitigation efforts across the country. I work right here in Washington, D.C. with federal clients on these important resilience-related issues. We have some great sessions for you today. Before we get into them, let's hear from our sponsor, the Natural Resources Defense Council. They have a video to share. Okay, thank you so much. Let's get into today's sessions on social justice, equity, and flood risk management. Our first presentation comes from two of my Guidehouse associates, Alyx Colgan and Ashanta Douglas. This session is about adapting risk communications to create equitable mitigation strategies. Just a real quick bio on Alyx, our lead presenter. She's a senior consultant at Guidehouse with 8 years experience in education and nonprofit leadership. And she puts this experience to work providing training, communications, and strategy solutions to federal clients. Alyx Colgan supports directorates across FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, providing communications, training and development, strategy and project management, and facilitation support. She has her master's degree in public health and a culminating thesis on community-driven disaster risk reduction. And her passion for equity shapes her approach to work. Let's go ahead to her video. Please be ready with questions on the other side so we can have an engaging dialogue with our two speakers. Thanks.
Good afternoon and welcome. We are so excited to welcome you here today and provide case studies for effective communications and partnership strategies for reaching socially, politically, and economically vulnerable communities. My name is Alyx Colgan, and I am a senior consultant at Guidehouse. Prior to joining Guidehouse, I worked in education as a teacher, and then later for an education nonprofit where I managed our school and principal partnerships. I work on Guidehouse's FEMA account team, where I support clients in strategic communications, project and program management, and training design and delivery. I am passionate about community-driven disaster risk reduction, and I believe that the best response and mitigation plans are co-created. I want to introduce you to my colleague, Ashanta Douglas, who will share a case study later on in this presentation.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ashanta Douglas, and I'm a manager at Guidehouse. Alyx and I have similar backgrounds in education and nonprofit management, going back to teaching together at the same high school in Miami. I currently work for Guidehouse's state and local government team, supporting clients in change management, project management, and strategic communications. I am currently supporting a large county in the Midwest with the Emergency Rental Assistance Program by providing project management and communication support to ensure equitable grant delivery. Later in the presentation, I'll be sharing a case study to illustrate the importance of community partnerships and communication efforts.
Vulnerability in disaster response and recovery typically refers to someone's predisposition to experience adverse effects from disasters and other hazards. Today, we will be specifically talking about people who have a diminished capacity to cope with, anticipate, and recover from the impact of a disaster. And I want to challenge you today to see communication as a key ingredient in decreasing a person or community's vulnerability. We know that under-resourced communities and members of racial and ethnic minority groups are more likely to be impacted by disasters and more likely to suffer disproportionately when a disaster occurs. And there are many reasons for this, including language barriers, perception of risk, distrust of government, and a lack of preparation and sufficient protection, largely stemming from income inequality. We also know that this disproportionate impact is rooted in insufficient communication and access to relevant information for people to make informed decisions about how to protect themselves against risk. At the center of increasing equity is increasing access. It is our job, all of our jobs, to ensure all people within our communities have access to information they need to make informed decisions. Acknowledging that resources are not equitably distributed across our society, we need to put in the time to learn and understand how to communicate with vulnerable populations and act from the belief that if we are not communicating to those who need to hear it most, we are not doing our jobs. And communication doesn't solve everything. Access to resources and funding will continue to be a challenge for vulnerable communities. However, working within our own influence means using communications as a way to increase access and ultimately to impact equity. So risk perception refers to our interpretation about risk, and specifically the judgment we make about those risks and the likelihood of negative occurrences such as injury, illness, disease, and death. Risk perception is an important concept because it tells us how people feel about risks and hazards around them, and it helps define which of those they will care about and how they will confront those risks. Risk perception is not easy to measure. It is rarely rational since the human brain uses a mixture of learned information with emotional appraisals when weighing risks. This tells us that understanding human behavior is key to creating effective communications because we need to speak to both the logical part of our brains as well as the emotional part of our brains. There are many factors that impact risk perception, and I want to draw your attention to three in particular. Those are trust, control, and awareness. We will use these factors to guide an effective communication strategy to reach vulnerable communities. The first factor is trust. When people trust the officials providing information about a particular risk or the process used to assess risk, they tend to be less afraid than when they don't trust the officials or the process. And I'll prove that this is true. Think about the current relationship between the media and the American public. Are there media outlets you trust to deliver your news? What about the ones that you don't trust? If the ones you don't trust told you to care about something, would you? Evidence says probably not. We seek out people and organizations that we believe care about us and will deliver us unbiased information. Within vulnerable communities, distrust is heightened due to social, political, and economic challenges that have eroded trust through unfair and unjust policies, and frankly, from a lack of inclusion in important decisions centered around their well-being. The second factor is control. Perceived control over outcomes is very important. And this factor can be explained when you think about people like me who are very afraid of flying in an airplane, but don't have the same fear of driving or riding in a car, despite the fact that automobile accidents kill disproportionately more people per year. We feel more in control with things that are familiar and where we believe we have the knowledge and skill to impact the outcomes. Finally, we have awareness. Media coverage of high-profile disasters raises awareness of particular risks more than others. Likewise, events that hit close to home, like a friend or family member who is diagnosed with cancer or loses their home in a flood, heightens risk perception for particular risks. And while these are not the only factors that impact risk perception, we will talk today about how we can impact trust, control, and awareness through effective and equitable communications. Let's talk first about trust. Building trust can take years. Therefore, this is one of the hardest factors for organizations and agencies to effectively do. First, a huge piece of building trust is in understanding the history and culture of the community you're trying to reach and using this knowledge to develop more effective communications. This can be done through research, and it can be effectively achieved through surveys and focus groups. A great example of the importance of understanding historical and cultural context occurred during the H1N1 outbreak. Healthcare workers in Washington state attempted to lead a vaccination campaign with a local Somali community. failing to realize that a handful of the H1N1 vaccine contained pork gelatin as a preservative. The addition of pork, generally seen to be dirty in the Muslim religion, led to a failure in the vaccination campaign. It is unlikely that research, a survey, or a focus group would have helped these healthcare workers. What they needed were local community members to share this knowledge with them and help them understand how to effectively communicate the risk of H1N1 and the benefit of the vaccination. This is where effective partnerships come in. Agencies can build relationships with grassroots organizations that are already trusted by the community and use them to help communicate their messages. A good question to ask is, who does this community trust? The answer to that could be religious leaders, local politicians, organizations, community leaders, and organizers. When you've pinpointed these people and organizations, you can build a partnership with them to help you understand the group you want to communicate to, and either have them communicate your message for you or use that partnership to help you determine any historical or cultural barriers that could impact your message. The next really important way to impact risk perception is to increase people's feelings of control. To highlight the importance of this, I want you to think about how many times you've avoided something because you felt you didn't have the means or the skill to tackle it. I asked this to a friend recently, and they told me that for years they wanted to buy stocks, but it always seemed too overwhelming, something they didn't think they had the knowledge, skill, or patience to figure out. Recently, they started investing in the stock market through an app because it was easy to set up and easy to get started. So how do we increase control and make people feel empowered that preparedness is within their reach? We can do this in two ways. First, by understanding their context, best achieved through sitting down and co-creating solutions and plans. And second, we can simplify what it looks like to prepare or respond to a disaster by giving options for mitigation or recovery that are easy to understand and whose process we make clear. Be prepared to roll up your sleeves and understand what communities need. This is also a really effective way to build trust. How might you co-create solutions and co-plan activities with communities? The impact of co-creation and co-planning is that communities and individuals will increase their feelings of control and empowerment through increased agency and choice. The second is to simplify preparedness. Give people options for preparedness and recovery that are within their abilities. And be explicit about the importance of these actions. Is one thing more important than the other? The key is to take something that might sound scary and turn it into something that is manageable and digestible. To put this into perspective, I want to highlight a study from Milstead, a grassroots organization in California trying to increase preparedness in vulnerable communities. They note that of those most vulnerable that they surveyed, 68% had recently seen or heard something related to disaster preparedness. Only 36% of them felt they were prepared. And this is important. The majority think preparing is important, but also believe it's expensive and scary. So how can we help communicate to communities and allow them to see disaster preparedness and risk mitigation as something they can do? How can we communicate actions that are easy and those that don't require significant resources? All of the things we talked about also drive awareness. There are two additional actions we can take. First, ensure communications are in the correct language and written at the correct level. Understand that translating is not the only step, as evidenced by the earlier example of the H1N1 vaccine distribution. Communications must be culturally relevant. Second, understand the news sources the community turns to and trusts. Ethnic media is a term you might have heard. It signifies media that is community-driven and represents the culture, ethnicity, and language of the intended audience. Seeking out local radio and print media sources that are community-specific will help you communicate to your targeted audience. We have talked a lot about the importance of the message and the importance of who delivers that message. This last point is about the channels the message goes through. Know who your community turns to for their news. As we highlight the next few case studies, I want you paying attention to these definitions that we provided from Harvard Health in thinking through how these apply to the case studies ahead.
Great, thank you, Alex. So with that, and using risk perception as our lens, we will look at 3 case studies to see how organizations and agencies have thought about trust, control, and awareness to increase preparedness and response. So in December 2020, the federal government allocated $25 billion to aid households that were financially impacted by COVID-19 by providing financial assistance for unpaid rent and utility bills. Funding was provided directly to states, U.S. territories, local governments, and tribes to distribute rental support to eligible residents. Over the last 3 months, I have been supporting a large county in the Midwest that received approximately $70 million through federal funding and needed to quickly develop policies and procedures to distribute money to residents in need. Within just 1 month, the county was able to establish a call center, application portal, large-scale marketing campaign, and receive more than 16,000 applications from tenants and landlords. Much of the county's success has been due to their decision to mobilize community partners. These partnerships were developed over the course of several years through proactive outreach to a number of housing stability and housing counseling organizations within the county. The county was able to launch their program in such a short period of time because they built strong relationships prior to the development of this program. Their partnerships included 19 individual nonprofit organizations, one of which is supporting the Emergency Rental Assistance Program by providing additional staff to their existing call center. And that call center will be able to answer questions from potential applicants and provide more than 150 languages to ensure equitable access and support for applicants. So after the call center receives a call from an applicant, they then refer applicants to one of the 18 partners who are providing application assistance and other housing stability services. During the application window, the center made just over 1,600 referrals for application support. So those are individuals that may not have had support before, but because of the partnerships that the county was able to develop, they'll be able to complete their application with the help of a nonprofit organization. With the help of our partners, we were able to reach more than 90,000 residents through a joint social media campaign, billboards, print advertisements, and other mediums. The county wanted to work with diverse organizations to ensure the network we were tapping into properly represented the diversity of the county's population. The partnerships included organizations aimed at supporting Arab American families, the Latinx community, and other region-specific organizations to ensure we're serving all parts of the county that are significantly impacted by COVID-19. So what are some of the lessons that we learned? We know that with experiences with discrimination, exclusion from social program opportunities, and harmful government actions rooted in racism, they've created individual and community level distrust in many vulnerable communities. Our team recognized that the best way to distribute our message about the COVID-19 economic opportunities were through trusted community partners, recognizing that part of communication is about who delivers the message. Many of the community partners were grassroots organizations who knew families directly impacted by COVID-19 and could ensure they received vital information, effectively expanding our reach and impact through community voices. I want to talk about the application of this case study. The work we did in partnership building to spread our message can be used across disasters and across communities. Early in the planning process, we recognized the limits of our potential reach, and we utilized nonprofits to allow us to expand our footprint, effectively using partnerships as a force multiplier to reach more people than advertising alone. Our community partners also helped people actually apply for grant funding. This is a new situation for everyone, but giving people tools and resources to help them apply for funding was an effective way to increase access because our partners worked alongside the applicants. And finally, we drove awareness through many languages our message was translated into to help ensure language access for all residents across the county. The result of our communication effort allowed for over 16,000 applications from all over the county with demographic data indicating that our message reached individuals with the greatest need for assistance. Turn it back over to Alyx.
Our second case study will focus on some of the recent California wildfires. Although wildfires have always been a disaster risk, California wildfires have been increasing in both intensity and frequency over the past several years. Undocumented immigrants are a vulnerable community that have been commonly overlooked during disaster risk communication efforts for several reasons. First, language has created a communication barrier, requiring additional effort from community and government officials to effectively communicate risk. Second, building trust with undocumented immigrant communities means establishing and maintaining partnerships with local community leaders, which takes deliberate time and effort long before a disaster strikes to ensure officials can successfully communicate risk during an emergency. Finally, government officials often fail to consider how their immigration status has led communities to be wary of accessing services from government organizations, which could be shared with the Department of Homeland Security and ultimately lead to deportation. During the 2018 Camp Fire, the 2017 Sonoma Complex fires, and the 2017 Thomas Fire, none of the Ventura, Butte, and Sonoma counties initially sent evacuation notices in languages other than English. Emergency information online later included an option for Google Translate in Spanish, but the Ventura County Offices of Emergency Services failed to assign staff for live translation during the disaster event. Immigration and Customs Enforcement often states that they will not check immigration statuses of evacuees. However, many individuals cited their fear of going to shelters because of the uniformed National Guard officers stationed outside. Despite these challenges, there was an example of a local radio station providing important information and resources to the community. During the North Bay fires in 2017, KBBF, a bilingual radio station in Santa Rosa, stepped up to translate evacuation information to the community when that information was not being translated by the local government. The president of the board of directors for the radio station told KQED in an interview, "We're a radio station, but we have information and they don't trust anyone else to give them that information." This really demonstrates the power of trusted community voices. The station invited local politicians to spread their messages, set up a donation center that shared life-saving resources when undocumented members of their community were too afraid to seek other resources, and even shared about local families who were providing meals to people in need. I want to highlight that this radio station stepped in because local government and organizations failed to communicate to communities in a language they could understand. They filled a need because they had to, and because government agencies continued to pour resources into things like shelters, failing to truly understand the fear undocumented individuals felt around deportation. Building trust is the key to effectively communicate your messages. To do this, you must identify who you want to communicate with, understand the historical factors that have eroded trust, and collaborate with those in the community who are already providing aid and relief. One of the greatest barriers to effective communications during the California fires were policies that created a perception of risk where seeking aid or shelter would potentially be riskier than staying in place. In a time where we want to increase people's sense of control, historic policies and practices were working against that. Beyond translating life-saving information to Spanish, this radio station was a staple in many undocumented immigrant households and a familiar source of information. They organized assistance for families and individuals in the community and ensured they had access to the information they needed, and were successful because the community trusted their long-standing relationship. Partnering with radio stations like this would be key for government agencies and non-governmental organizations in the future, given their access to the community and the trust they've already established. And our third case study. One of the Miami communities significantly affected by COVID-19 was the Haitian American community. At one point, about 6 months into the pandemic, Haitian Americans made up 5% of all COVID-19 deaths in Miami. And this is notable for two reasons. First, Haitian Americans make up about 4% of the county's population. And second, demographics of those who have died seldom include ethnic data. This only started being captured by medical examiners after the city realized the challenge they were facing. And even then, the information wasn't always captured, indicating that the count is probably inaccurate and potentially even more concerning. While many factors have led to the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on communities of color all across the United States, for residents in Little Haiti, additional social and cultural factors impacted the spread of the virus in the community. One of those factors, noted by a doctor who leads a public health task force for the Haitian American Coalition of South Florida, is an embarrassment and a fear that friends and family would not want to socialize with them. In a culture that values connection to friends and family, where greeting each other with a kiss on both cheeks is standard practice, that would be a huge deterrent to admitting you had or were potentially exposed to COVID-19. Some of that fear and stigma is also rooted in historical discrimination from the HIV/AIDS epidemic. This is compounded by language barriers and cultural views on Western medicine versus more traditional herbal remedies. So what did the county do to reach this population? They included Haitian Creole translators at press conferences. They also established a testing center at a Catholic church who holds Mass in Haitian Creole. Miami-Dade County has indicated that 22% of the money they've spent on outreach related to COVID-19 has been on radio, billboards, newspapers, and ads targeting the Haitian community. Many of the ads they plan to run in the future will feature medical professionals of color to deliver their message. At the end of 2020, the city also purchased airtime for a COVID-19 campaign to run for 30 days on a cable news station, Island TV, who provides news in Haitian Creole. One of the people who's discussed as a key driver in many of these strategies was a local Haitian American county commissioner who played an enormous role in raising awareness about the challenges and stigma within his community to then help suggest actions the city might take to effectively reach the community. This small example highlights the importance of diversity throughout government and across organizations. When we talk about the decisions that we make as emergency management or mitigation professionals, one of the things we need to talk about are the people at the table. If you do not have a diverse group of people helping make decisions about who you're communicating to, how, and through which channels, you will inevitably miss a group or fail to understand or effectively communicate with them. Even if your staff lacks this diversity, you can bring community members and leaders to the table to ensure they help you make important decisions and inform your strategy. Miami-Dade County took steps to impact many of the factors that impact risk perception that we've discussed throughout the presentation, and there's still more to do. It's important to address the way they incorporated ethnic media into their strategy, recognizing where the community they were intending to reach got their news from. They also learned about the community they wanted to reach and developed specific strategies to reach them, including using a trusted community church to conduct testing. Over the last 25 minutes, we have talked about strategies different communities have used to impact both mitigation as well as recovery. We rooted each of these in the idea of risk perception, attempting to increase trust, awareness, and control by leveraging community partnerships, considering the channels we're using to spread our message, and thinking about how we can increase people's perception of their ability to affect the outcome. You can use all of these strategies to impact equitable delivery of risk communications. And as we said earlier, you can actually decrease vulnerability through effective communications. We're so excited to hear how you incorporate these strategies into future communication. Please reach out to us and share any questions or any feedback you have. Thank you so much for joining us here today, and we look forward to hearing from you soon.
Great, thanks for your participation in this session. The comments have been amazing. Thank you for that continued dialogue. So we're here with our two presenters, Alyx Colgan and Ashanta Douglas. They're going to answer some questions for us. I've got many to get through, so we'll try and get through as many as possible in the short time that we have. First, for Alyx, we had a question from Jennifer. what deliverables would you suggest to be able to have a tangible win for a group or a large win for a member of a group to help build trust?
So, Jennifer, I think that's a great question. I think from my experience, I think at times we get so focused on an outcome that we forget the importance of the process. So I think having a process orientation means that we're thinking about how people are feeling and really rooting our engagement in how we're interacting with people and how they are going through the process and what that feels like to them. So thinking about deliverables, I think, is kind of tough because ideally your focus group would also be sort of led by the people that are in your focus group. So I would be thinking about what the group wants to come from those focus groups and what kinds of things they want to build together.
Okay, great. Ashanta, anything to add to that? We've got plenty of other questions if you're good.
We'll go to another question.
All right, great. And I apologize for looking over here. I feel like a 911 dispatcher with these two screens and all the great comments coming in. So Ashanta, folks wanted to know, with that first case study, were nonprofits or other grassroots partners compensated for their time?
They were actually. So they were compensated for their time in the sense that any time that they put into the program, whether that's staff time or the cost for helping with marketing, any of those costs, they were being reimbursed through the federal grant that was provided for emergency rental assistance. And so that is the way they were compensated, up to a cap.
Wonderful, thank you. And have you found that nonprofit partners can get overtapped as they do community work in times of crisis and disaster? And could that affect the relationship piece when it comes to collaboration and partnership?
Yes, of course. I definitely think that that is something to be aware of. However, what we did with our program is we put out a kind of all call to all of the partnerships that the county had already developed through a survey. And we asked them some very specific questions. How many staff could you dedicate towards this? Could you start by, this launch date, which was a very quick turnaround. So we left it open to them to really assess, do they have the capacity and the staffing to help with the program. The other thing too, we wanted to allow people to potentially scale up their staffing because we knew that some of these nonprofits, that's an opportunity they're looking for, is to add additional staff. And so this was a way to do that because we're not the only people in the state utilizing nonprofits. And so, being able to scale up not only for our program, but for other programs could be important to them and to their work.
Yeah, great comments. As a former nonprofit guy myself, I couldn't agree more. Alyx, what's a good strategy for starting a relationship prior to really needing that partner to accomplish a specific task?
Oh man, I think one of a great place to start is really thinking about what that mutual benefit is. I think oftentimes we go into partnerships and we think about what we need from someone else, but what is also the benefit that we're able to provide to them. So, going into communities and wanting to communicate our message, what is it that communities also need? Oftentimes we hear about this planning deficit that exists where communities really need people to come and plan alongside them. So, as a way to be that partner to someone, can you help them plan alongside them while also using that as a space to communicate your message?
Fantastic. Well, let me see. With the community.
That's a hard one. That's a hard one. I would say, I think for us, we were able to have a very far reach with a little bit of money. And so I would say it was probably less than 2% of our total funds. But I don't know what the full amount could be. That's just from our project.
All right, good to know. We'll have to continue the conversation soon. These materials are downloadable and available through the conference website. But Alyx and Ashanta, thank you so much for the great information. We're going to roll to our next presenter. And our next presenter is Terence Milstead, PhD. He has over 2 decades of domestic and international public affairs experience in issues management, strategic partnership development, and communications, and other community outreach activities. He currently works for Resilience Action Partners under the FEMA Community Engagement and Risk Communication Contract. And he serves as the Community Engagement and Risk Communication Liaison for FEMA Region 3, which I believe is based out of Philadelphia. Terence holds a master's degree and a doctorate in urban and regional planning, and he spent several years as a university instructor and researcher, which comes up heavily in his session. It's, of course, called Housing, Security, and Flood Risk Mitigation Activities. We look forward to your continued comments as we get the video rolling. Please be ready. Terence, I'm sure I'll be ready for all of our questions once the video is concluded.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Terence Milstead, and I am with Ogilvy out of the Washington, D.C. government practice. For those of you not familiar with Ogilvy, we're mostly known for our marketing advertising work. However, we're also deeply invested in the strategic communications space, including around issues related to resiliency, as well as flood risk, climate change. So today, I'm very happy to be here talking to you about a topic that might not at first seem like it has a lot to do with floodplain management or what you would typically hear at a conference like this. But I hope that as I continue through my presentation today, the connection will become clearer. Today, I'm going to talk about housing security and flood risk mitigation activities. And to set the context, we already know that climate change and sea level rise and floods of increasing severity and frequency are costing a lot of money to the economy and to human lives, just in terms of the damage. $1.7 trillion is the amount of damage that the U.S. has seen from natural disasters since 1980. The vast majority of that rather has come from flooding. And again, we know that this is just going to get worse and worse as climate change progresses. So that's the context, one with which we're all too familiar. Today, I want to talk about what are the things that lead to people's decisions to invest time and money into improving their dwellings. And especially, I want to look at housing tenure security and the role that that plays. Now, what do we mean by housing tenure security? For the purposes of this discussion, we simply mean the extent to which somebody feels like they're not going to be suddenly displaced from their home. And there can be a lot of things that go into those types of feelings, whether you own the property in which you live, the rights to the land. But again, for the purposes of this discussion, we're simply talking about, do you feel secure in your dwelling? The reason I want to focus on this is because in my own past life as a university researcher, I did housing research, and I looked at this very topic in the former Soviet Union, where I looked at, what are the things that are influencing people's decisions to invest money into improving, the old Soviet era housing in which they lived. What I found in my research and what's come across in all of the research that's been done on this topic is that, again, feelings of tenure security are determinative, that they matter. That people over time will naturally improve their dwellings if institutional conditions allow them the freedom to do so, and if they feel like they won't have to move the next day or the next week. So how does that relate to flood risk? So what I want to talk about specifically today is the intersection of those types of home improvement activities and how they overlap with flood risk and with feelings of tenure security. So in other words, within this broader body of research on the factors that influence people's home improvement decisions, right, can we look more specifically at how mitigation improvements are made to households and the role that tenure security might or might not play in those types of decisions? So there's a big body of literature out there on, again, DIY home improvements or do-it-yourself home improvements and the things that lead to those. A lot of the literature within that body of work, again, focuses on tenure security and the things that go into making people feel safe or not as in their dwelling place, and again, their ability to stay there. So my question today, the research question that I started with was, does housing tenure security influence household level flood risk mitigation decisions? Has anyone looked at this? If not, why should someone? And if nobody's looked at it, what do the findings from parallel research suggest? And how might those lead to a different kind of conversation between floodplain managers and housing policy experts? So to answer the question that I just described to you, I looked at about 50 different academic articles from all over the world that looked at, again, this topic of mitigation activity. What are the things that lead to mitigation activity? And what I was looking for, to just visualize it here, again, was feelings of tenure security as the independent variable or the causal factor, and then household level flood risk mitigation activity as the dependent variable or the outcome, right? So that was the relationship that I started out looking for in the literature. First finding was I didn't find anything that reflected directly on that line of research. So there's a gap there that needs to be filled. And I'll come back later in this presentation to how we might go about collectively filling that gap. But what I did find in my research were a few lines of inquiry that hit all around this topic, even though they weren't exactly what I was looking for, they were parallel. And so I want to talk about what were those things I found and what might we learn from the research that has been done. So the first thing was there was a good bit of research out there that looked at household level activity and how those individual activities contribute to overall community risk or reducing that risk. And what we found is that, or what the research has found, is that all of these little household level activities, whether it's instorming flood vents or anchoring utilities, all of these over time combined have a significant effect on reducing flood risk in a community. One study that I looked at from, I believe it was Austria, found that non-structural measures and household level activities combined can decrease community flood risk by as much as 30%. Now, I will say that in that study, they were including within household level activities the decision to move, right, to get out of harm's way. So it's a broad definition, but still the point here is that all of those household level actions matter. It's not just community level mitigation activities that are important. The second line of research that I found when I looked at the literature was research that looked at what are the things that themselves lead to those types of household level activities. And what came through in the research were things like the efficacy of the intervention. Does it work or does it not work? How much does it cost? How difficult is it to implement? And what are people's prior experiences with flooding, right? And so what came across from that research is that to motivate residents to take action within their dwelling, we have to not just communicate the risk of flooding, but also the possibility, the effectiveness, and the cost of taking private precautionary measures. So in other words, we can't just say, this is your risk, and this is what you can do about it. We have to say, this is your risk, this is what you can do about it. This is what each of those interventions might cost you. This is how difficult they might be to implement. And this is the likelihood that you're going to see a positive result. Right? So again, very interesting, but not what I was looking for, right? That was a different type of relationship. So the third type of relationship that I saw in the literature looked at what are the things that relate to displacement, right? People's feeling that they're gonna have to leave their dwelling at some point. So flooding was certainly one of the things that was found to affect people's sense of being able to stay in a place long-term, but so were things like gentrification and nature-based solutions, which I know sounds counterintuitive, but I'll explain more in just a moment. So within that body of literature, what we found is that there are things like nuisance flooding, property values that are falling, costs of rent going up, that can strongly encourage households to relocate. And the reason that was of interest to me was because obviously, if you feel like you're going to relocate, right, even if it's by choice, then that could influence your willingness to undertake certain mitigation activities, but also your receptiveness to messaging about flood risk, right? Because if you're thinking of leaving, it might make you feel like, well, I don't really need to pay attention to that risk messaging because I won't be here that long anyways. And the bigger question is, do we know what people are thinking in different neighborhoods when we're trying to communicate flood risk? Do we know what's happening with property values? Do we know what's happening with nuisance flooding or with socio-demographic change? One of the research studies that I looked at the Calgary flood of 2013, which I believe was the costliest natural disaster in Canadian history. And what this study found was that when they looked at predictors of people's mobility plans, in other words, people's plans to move either in a year or in 2 years or in 5 years, what they found was that a stronger predictor of people's plans to move than the actual risk of flooding was people's sense of place-based attachment. And that's defined as if they thought the neighborhood was a great place to live, if they were invested in the community, if there was a sense of social capital, that was a stronger predictor of whether or not they planned on moving than the actual risk of experiencing another flood like the one they experienced in 2013. So again, the point here is that we need to figure out how to get at that type of information, right? And not just think about empirical evidence, right? And the actual risk of flooding. How are people perceiving other things that are influencing their decision-making? Climate gentrification is something that came through in this research. I think the first study that I know of that looked at this was in 2018 or 2019, Harvard University looked at property values in Miami. And what they found is that while property values were increasing across the metropolitan area, they were increasing much, much faster or many times greater at higher elevations. In other words, at sea level, property values were increasing 8-fold, but they were increasing 11 and a half times at higher elevations. And the thing is, at higher elevations, you have a lot of transitional neighborhoods, right? And so people were being displaced because people were moving out of harm's way, away from the coast and into these neighborhoods. So again, if you're part of that experience, if you're experiencing, an influx of people into your neighborhood because they are trying to get away from the threat of rising sea levels, clearly that can influence your sense of security in your own dwelling, your ability to stay in your neighborhood. Green gentrification was another line of research that I found. And what the literature showed is that in some places where things like green stormwater infrastructure or other nature-based solutions are being installed, it's actually driving up property values and resulting in, again, some displacement, some gentrification. So this one's tricky because it actually implies that if we're successful at a community level, right, in putting in interventions like, again, green stormwater infrastructure or things of that nature, might that then at a household level inhibit people's willingness to undertake certain mitigation activities because it increases their sense of feeling like they're going to be eventually displaced? We don't know. The important point here is we should be thinking about the question and asking. So again, that was an interesting line of research, but it wasn't the one I was looking for, right? It wasn't the exact relationship that I wanted to see. So to sort of summarize where we are at this point, I had expected or hoped to find some sort of research on feelings of tenure security and household level mitigation activity. I didn't find that. What I found instead were these 3 other lines of research that, again, very interesting, important, but there's a gap in the literature. So this is where I want to pose a few questions that I hope will lead to a broader discussion about this topic. So question number one, who cares about any of this? Why does this matter? Well, it matters because, again, something that the literature showed was that for the last several years, or at least for the last number of years, a lot of the studies that have looked at this have sort of overlooked the complexity of decision making, right? They've looked at human behavior as sort of static and predictable. And so this line of research builds on this idea that we need to look at a very broad spectrum of factors that could influence people's decision making. And we need to consider the broader socioeconomic context and the psychosocial dynamics of decision making, right? Whenever we're trying to understand how we should craft flood risk messaging or risk communication messaging in general. The second question is, what matters? What are the types of things based on the research that has been done that we should be looking at or thinking about? Well, certainly gentrification. When FEMA maps houses into the special floodplain hazard area, are we looking at what's going on with the sociodemographics in a neighborhood, or with the property values, or are any of those households in gentrifying neighborhoods? Looking at sociodemographics more broadly, how many people are there in that neighborhood or within that set of households that are from other countries? One of the studies that I looked at countries around the world and how people in different cultural contexts make decisions about flood risk mitigation activity. And what they found was that people in the developing world, or less developed countries, as the nomenclature is these days, tend to favor more costly interventions, more costly home mitigation activities. And the reason is because the government's not there to help them do that, right? So they know it's kind of on themselves. So if we know that a neighborhood that we're trying to communicate with has people from outside the United States, we need to be thinking about, well, what is the context? What are they used to based on the geocultural, the political context, in the place from which they might have originally migrated or emigrated, rather. Looking at housing type, I've included a picture here of mobile home communities because we know that mobile home communities are very often held as land banks, right? Where the property on which they sit is held by a single developer who uses it as a land bank. So when the surrounding property values have risen sufficiently, all of those people would be displaced and the property would be sold for a profit. So if you live in a mobile home community and you know that this is the dynamic, might that not affect your sense of tenure security and your willingness to sort of do things to protect yourself and your property? And I know this because I've done research on mobile home communities, and it's a much more complicated topic. But again, are we looking at housing type and considering those sorts of factors? The volatility of the housing market, right? Are we considering that? Are we looking at proximity to the coast whenever we're communicating with individuals? Even though sea level rise and climate change is something that's so incremental, right? Sometimes it's hard to notice from year to year that it's taken place. There is research that shows that people are absorbing the message and they are thinking about long-term climate change in terms of the viability of some of the coastal residences. So are we getting at that? Are we looking at people's past experiences with flooding? Studies have shown that for about 3 to 6 or 7 years after a flood, people tend to remember and to be strongly influenced by that experience. After that, the effect tends to level off. Similarly, people who've never experienced a flood, they have a difficult time conceptualizing the risk, the damage, right? So their lack of experience attenuates their ability to understand that risk. So again, are we looking at those sorts of factors when we reach out to individuals, to households? So the final question is, what do we do with this information? So the first thing that I pointed out is that there's a research gap. So that needs to be filled. But I would say that that doesn't need to wait for the academic community to step up and fill it in. Practitioners can play a role in that by reaching out to academic institutions,
Okay, welcome back. Hope you enjoyed that presentation from Terence. A lot of great information in there. And I personally have so many questions, but let's get to the audience member questions since we've got quite a few of those as well, Terence. First question for you is, have you looked at how flood regulations and construction requirements impact home values and displacement in historically distressed communities?
So that did come through in some of the research. I think the study that jumps immediately to mind, just as a case study of that, was from Jamaica Bay in Brooklyn. And it was, I'll convey this quickly. It was a community that was being mapped into the SFHA, Special Flood Hazard Area, but they had also been the target of subprime lending in 2008, right, during the housing crisis. And so they had experienced what was described as plundered housing wealth. Right? So to make up for that, some of them had been doing things like renting out basement spaces, right, to bring in some extra income. And of course, being mapped into the SFHA, as I understood it, because of the NFIP requirements, there were prohibitions against doing that, or at least it was strongly discouraged, right, to do something that would be in contradiction with the whole idea of safety, both physically and in terms of human life. So that was one example of where people were responding to something that happened, right, to their financial well-being and trying to respond in the best way possible, and then restrictions, regulations related to floodplain management affected them. So I think maybe the point there is that, again, as we're sort of looking at capacity within neighborhoods and how they're affected, we have to take a long-term view, right? And think about what happened 10 years ago that might still be affecting people, and how are they responding to things that have adversely affected them in even the last couple of decades. I'll stop there, but I could keep going. I'd love to hear more from the questioner, so we can definitely follow up separately.
Why don't you go ahead and give your email now, Terence, just so that folks have that, since we have such valuable content to get through?
Certainly. It's my first and last name separated by dots. So terence.milstead@ogilvy.com.
Awesome. Yeah, I agree with you. I was a Peace Corps volunteer in a community that had experienced a hurricane 10 years previous, and I was just shocked at the level of recovery still ongoing that far beyond. But let's get to another question here. How do we build community connection, co-solve for social, ecological, and economic well-being to restore the ecological process and build flood-safe, affordable communities?
Wow, that's a big question. But without thinking about it at length, and I'd love to, because there's so much there, I think, to talk about. What immediately jumps to mind is when I was a housing researcher, one of the housing gurus that I turned to was a guy named John F.C. Turner, who wrote about housing as a verb. In other words, not thinking about housing as a physical structure, but thinking about it as a process by which people become invested in a place. And then the extension of that is thinking about models like, well, Habitat for Humanity, where people build one another's housing. And so there's this sort of creation of social capital through the process of creating housing in a community, as opposed to seeing it as a market function. So I guess I'm saying in a very long-winded way, thinking about the process of housing and how we all can contribute to the development of housing can be used as a way of creating, social capital, which then makes flood risk mitigation a shared responsibility, I would hope.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the trillion-dollar question right there that we have to try and answer. So I've gone ahead and approved all questions to see if we can get a little prioritization going in the question and answer here. We do have to move to our third presentation, but thank you, Terence. Such interesting research. I hope maybe I can run into you at the next ASFPM in person and ask you more about this particular presentation.
I hope so, Matt. Thank you for the time.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, we're going to move to our last presentation today from Dr. Merrie Koester. She is a veteran science teacher and educational researcher specializing in youth-based participatory action research. Her work is focused on building research practice partnerships between higher education, schools, community groups, and civic leaders to effect positive change in historically underserved schools and communities. In 2016, she initiated the action research study called Kids Teaching Flood Resilience, which positions low-income youth in low-income schools as resources of knowledge and flood resilience. Each new Kids Teaching Flood Resilience case study features input from local emergency management experts, government officials, meteorologists, cultural leaders, and many, many others. She's going to talk to us about getting hurricane smart, taking on the problem of educational vulnerability. So let's listen in for now, and we will have our questions hopefully long before the end of the hour here.
Okay.
Hello, my name is Merrie Koester, and I am a science teacher educator for the University of South Carolina Center for Science Education, working primarily in Title I middle and high schools in Charleston, South Carolina, my hometown. As all of you likely know, Title I schools serve low-income, historically marginalized families who live in some of our most flood-prone neighborhoods. Through no fault of their own, these families and these youth now disproportionately bear the impacts and hazard risks associated with climate change and sea level rise. Every time a school or community floods, it's a potential emergency situation. Never has it been more important for public hazard education to result in significant risk reduction behaviors. Acting on the message to get ready is so important. Recognizing this fact, In December of 2015, the City of Charleston, South Carolina published their first sea level rise strategy plan, defining as a key challenge the need to better communicate and inform citizens about the direct local impacts of sea level rise as a way to enhance public safety. Many cities and counties nationwide have faced similar public safety concerns. Educator, activist, and scholar Paulo Freire has written that human beings are because they are in a situation. Daily, you work on behalf of your communities to navigate ever worsening and more frequent flooding situations. Hurricanes in a time of global warming and a pandemic present some of the worst situations imaginable. The literature on vulnerability and resilience describes a problem, a phenomenon, called educational vulnerability, which is defined as the lack of access to or awareness of informational resources that might reduce one's risk of harm from a potential hazard. Some of the factors cited as causes of educational vulnerability include digital divides, lack of cable TV, bad Wi-Fi signal, and low reading levels. As a literacy and communication arts specialist, I think there's far more to educational vulnerability as a hazard than this. I believe that when there is no basis for empowerment, the information to action link will remain broken. This slide bears reading aloud, and it comes straight from a wonderful literature review from Peyton and Johnston in 2001. Traditional approaches to public hazard education largely fail to accommodate the community and social psychological factors that facilitate the relationship between risk perception and risk reduction behavior. A relationship between perception and risk reduction behavior. When I work with students in low-income Title I schools, I ask them if they think that school is something that is done for and with them. In other words, it's educative, or something that is done to them. And sadly, they say the latter. It's especially alarming to me as a science educator to hear them report feeling especially marginalized in their science and STEM classes, especially when their teacher's focus is on getting the right answers on a standardized test. Please let me add that for any teacher being mandated to teach to a test, this is especially oppressive as well. Scholar Dr. Bettina Love writes powerfully on the importance of abolitionist teaching and the desire among our youth of color to do more than survive or pass school tests that have nothing to do with improving the quality of their life. Abolitionist teaching calls for working in solidarity with communities of color while drawing on, and listen to these teaching practices, imagination, creativity, healing, boldness, determination, and visionary thinking. Who wouldn't thrive in a learning environment like that? Did you know that the United Nations 1996 Habitat Agenda specifically addresses the importance of participatory processes with youth to create better conditions in cities and towns, and especially to make use of their insights, creativity, and thoughts on the environment? Community vulnerability expert Dr. Betty Morrow reminded us that just because a population is labeled at risk does not imply that they are either helpless or lack agency. You'll soon see that the youth in this program are powerful and agentic. With all of this in mind, today I'm asking you to consider, and here's my key message. What if youth were positioned, legitimized, and empowered to become ambassadors of community hurricane resilience education? What if they were challenged to show that science, knowledge, and its application are absolutely required to powerfully communicate hurricane and flood hazard risks to their families? Today, I invite you to imagine in your own community a flooding school, house of worship, or housing project at the center of an educative, resilience generating system. I did imagine such a thing. And in order to determine where the Title I schools were that were most susceptible to flooding, I sought out the help of mapping and GIS specialist Brian Pokrant from the city of Charleston, who generously gave of his time to help me generate this kind of map, which basically uses NOAA's sea level rise viewer inside ArcGIS mapping. I very quickly identified that literally all of our Title I schools on the Charleston Peninsula would be flooded out with a 5 feet inundation. For my first school or case study, I selected Charleston Development Academy because it seemed to be the most flood impacted of any of these Title I schools. When I went to visit the school, I found that it was located in a housing project on the west side of Charleston. And the principal and the science teacher welcomed me to develop the first Kids Teaching Flood Resilience program with their 8th grade. The idea was to focus on real people, real places, and real problems. Full disclaimer, I had never done such an ambitious participatory action research project before. Nevertheless, I felt called to do this, and I set forth this action research claim. When positioned, empowered, and legitimized as resources of knowledge and action, historically marginalized middle and high school youth have the energy and ability to create and communicate hazard risk information that results in risk reduction behaviors. I set out to include the criteria for effective community resilience programs. The program needed to have a high degree of self-efficacy in that the students had to believe they were up to the task. It needed to lead to community empowerment, center problem-focused coping, and develop a sense of community and commitment to action. I told you it was definitely ambitious. And it was, and still is, but so worth it. I conveyed to the students that they themselves are like this hand crank generator with the clear message that no energy in, no work out. And that once there was this commitment to accept the challenge of getting place smart, flood smart, and hurricane smart, our work could then begin. The work proceeded through a process that spells out DARE. So the drawing in of energy is the exact same thing that has to happen if a hurricane is going to form. So we wanted to form a hurricane of resilience. We couldn't do that without going out into the flooding place, noticing where it was flooding, trying to see where the system was failing, studying historical maps. Gradually, we began to imagine resilience as a culture. And in the end, or you could call it a beginning, we had a classroom of youth who felt truly empowered, as you will soon see. Two of our most important driving principles have been summed up powerfully in Amanda Gorham's poem, Earthrise, which takes on the challenge of climate change. Gorham reminds us that we have to get the facts straight, because getting the facts straight is what gets us to act. Amanda Gorham, it is never too soon to choose hope, especially when we are working with our community's youth. Our methodology is empowering and agentic. It allows students to collect their own scientific evidence, use their own reasoning, make their own arguments, and most of all, design and publicly share their own hazard risk messaging. We use a 3-question approach, which sounds kind of like a rap. You can beat this up. What can you notice? What can you know? What can you do with the info? Watch and see what happens when we use that approach. At first, few students had ever taken the time to consider where they thought all the water was coming from on the many days their school was flooded, even on sunny days. We called this the forever puddle. Their answers for where the water was coming from ranged from God to rain to I don't know, but it's always there now. What they did agree on was that flooding presented them with a situation and it was getting worse. I asked them to write about it. I'm really worried about coming to school because I have to walk in the floodwater and I don't like it, and my shoes are getting wet and my clothes are getting dirty and the water is nasty. Where do these waters come from? As we advanced from the noticing phase of the work, the knowing began. It's going to be a bad flood day around here. King tide and a storm, both at the same time. The drains will fail, just like they always do on days like this. As for the study of patterns and cause and effect relationships, they soon realized through field study and historical maps that housing projects in schools placed on or near filled and paved salt marsh wetlands are now at ground zero for flood hazards in an era of sea level rise. It's been in the doing and the making phase of the work where these youth have really stepped up. Here, Tanisha and Kieria have announced that they are flood resilient citizen scientists. You can hear their talk on the Kids Teaching Flood Resilience Projects page. Their classmates are on a mission to be part of the flooding solution in Charleston. The most beautiful thing is that our youth in this program have had the support of a growing educative resilience generating system. Hard-working, incredibly busy professionals from our emergency management office, the mayor's office, the school district, higher ed scholars from the College of Charleston, the Citadel of the South Carolina Sea Grant Consortium, expert stormwater engineers in our community, and an amazing team of community art mentors have all stepped up to make this possible. It makes you proud to live in a community like Charleston, South Carolina. We've begun to see resilience as a personal quest and source of community empowerment. Here's a screenshot of the Kids Teaching Flood Resilience Network. Schools, city offices, higher ed, artists, media specialists. It is an amazing network of care and concern. The Kids Teaching Flood Resilience program has been recognized as a Weather Ready Nation Ambassador Program of Excellence. Our content is free and open source and is vetted by city emergency management specialists, National Weather Service meteorologists, stormwater management engineers, and our civic leaders. Our program's Weather Ready ambassadors are Weather Smart, Play Smart, Storm Surge Smart, and Prep Smart. They understand and can communicate what to notice, know, and do in the event of an extreme weather event. In 2018, Kids Teaching Flood Resilience lost all of our main funding. Just when we thought we were going under, Dr. Jen Albert, director of the Citadel STEM Center, and you can see here's a picture of the Citadel dealing with its own flooding situation, stepped up to provide in-kind support and staff for the Simmons Pinckney project. They were and continue to be an amazing source of support, knowledge, and action. In the last year, we received financial donations from the South Carolina Association of Hazard Mitigation and Davis and Floyd Engineers. Thank you, thank you, thank you. We are always seeking donations to keep this work going. You can go to the Kids Teaching Flood Resilience website to fully explore the projects we facilitated so far. Please use the artifacts we've created. I'm going to quickly try to show you some outtakes from the work in the time we have left. So here is a photo of teacher Merrie Adeogun, who is a rock star in her own right, participating in the music video Step Up, Get Ready, Respond. There's a link to the video on the website. I highly, highly encourage you to listen to it so you can get the whole feel of it. But here's just a little bit.
Gotta be resilient, you gotta survive, know what to do to keep yourself alive. Love.
Again, I've captured a couple of screenshots. You have to know what to do to keep yourself alive. Here are students making emergency kits with the Charleston Youth Service Program, which is another amazing program in Charleston, South Carolina. The students worked with stormwater engineers, and we got resources from, again, the city of Charleston on storm drain anatomy. So here they are studying and drawing storm drains and learning why they fail in a high tide, full moon, rain bomb event. I embedded messaging from the office of Mark Wilbert, Emergency Chief Resilience Officer in Charleston, along with Daniel Flessis and Shannon Scaff, to develop the emergency planning. And when there's a crisis, you've got to make a plan. And we learned what needed to be in that plan. Use your head, know your route. Stay together if you need to get out. These are things that you think you're going to do, but if you don't plan for them, the wheels might come off. Back to the science. You have to know the facts so you know how to act. Here are students understanding why we have tides, why we have moon phases, and why the phase of the moon has a big impact on how high the tide is. You got to know what to do, what to watch, and where to go. That was an amazing experience. And hats off to videographer Lamar Hunter for creating that video together with Lorna Roberts and her husband, who owns their own reporting studio, and gave pro bono time to digitize that video. Next, it occurred to me that we really did need to come up with a way to assess prior hurricane literacy levels. I was then invited to create a hurricane resilience program for the 8th grade faculty at Morningside Middle, then under the leadership of Principal Stephanie Flock. And from that professional development stepped up an amazing teacher named Horace Mann, who said, I want to continue this work with you. And we created the Get Hurricane Smart PSA. Hopefully this will work.
Oh,
Guys, I just checked the NHC. There's a hurricane coming. That was a few days out of the blue. I know not. What you just said proves your hurricane doubt. Maya, I bet you're not so hurricane smart yourself. Oh yeah? You think NHC stands for not hardly cute?
at least I know how to swim. Do the rest of you? Yes, sir. The number one cause of death from hurricanes is drowning from storm surge. Now, wait a minute. We're all hurricane dumb, so take the Get Hurricane Smart Kahoot test right now. To get to the Get Hurricane Smart test, first you need to download the Kahoot app on your cell phone. Touch the magnifying glass icon above. Now, type in Get Hurricane Smart in the search bar and touch the magnifying glass icon on the keyboard. Click on the Get Hurricane Smart choice. You're almost there. You can scroll down to see the questions first if you want to. Press play when you're ready. To practice on your own, choose single player or practice. Go back to the questions you missed so you can get Hurricane Smarter like us.
Again, I've come back to the importance of youth seeing leaders in the community come to show that their work matters. Here, in this scene, you see Ron Morales, National Weather Service meteorologist, Shannon Scaff, Emergency Management Director, Katie Faith, who was then Charleston County Floodplain Manager, and Mr. Butch Bartfield, whom we've lost this year, who is an amazing Emergency Management Director for Charleston County. And over here, off the camera, Mark Wilbert, Resilience Director of the City of Charleston. We're all in this together. We can't do it unless we do it collectively and with an ethic of care and concern. I want to share with you a letter that was written by a Burke High School student to the Coast Guard team that Shannon Scaff, who used to be a rescue swimmer for the Coast Guard, now Emergency Management Director, he brought a team of Coast Guard helicopter to the school so that students could understand the dire peril they would be in if they didn't leave. Here's the letter. Dear Coast Guard crew, I want to thank you for coming out and showing us all how you all save people. Before you came, people were looking at us like we were some animals, but we don't know how to act, but y'all helped us show them otherwise. Not only did you help us show them different, but you also taught us that we should always be prepared and follow directions when we need to evacuate, and that if we don't, we can endanger your lives too. Sincerely, Alaya. So what's next? I'm so excited to tell you that we are working with some College of Charleston students, Simmons Pinckney Middle, 2 Houses of Worship Youth Ministries, and filmmaker Tony Bell from Charleston to create a film that's called Never Say Whatever, especially in a hurricane. It is our idea that we will use this film to kick off a Get Hurricane Smart family-based public information event led by trained Kids Teaching Flood Resilience teams. The whole idea, again, to mitigate pre-disaster conditions of educational vulnerability. I'm hoping that you have questions and that you could imagine a Get Hurricane Smart program in your own community. I'm also incredibly interested in the messaging you would add to the work as it continues to evolve. Please do join us and reach out. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Merrie. What a great presentation. Love the dialogue too. As a huge proponent of youth preparedness myself, it's just fantastic to know that communities across the country are embracing this effort. Now, Merrie had to sign off for another activity. She's actually presenting at a different conference starting right at 4. She wanted me to pass along her email so that anybody who wants to get in touch with her can, and I will also send her the questions you shared in the chat. Her email is MERRIEKOESTER So it's her first and last name, just as it's spelled in the bios for this presentation. And it's first name, last name at comcast.net. But overall, I just want to say thanks for a great hour and a half. Wonderful to hear all these perspectives about how we can increase equity in our mitigation planning and disaster resilience. Really looking forward to working with you all as we push forward on this important initiative. Thanks for your time today.